Note taker 16, Charles Darwin and Natural Selection. In 1831, there was a young student by the name of Charles Darwin who was very curious about life on this earth and wanting to find out more. He was not very rich. He was very poor. To get to college, he actually lived in the back of this bar he worked in and was able to use his money that he made there just to purchase books. But his real passion is he really wanted to see the world. So Charles Darwin signed up to be a crew member on the USS Beagle. And with this, he was able to travel the world. And at every stop, the captain allowed Charles Darwin to get off the boat and be able to study the plants and the animals he found, so that while they were en route, he had to be a crew member, but when they stopped places, he was able to continue his studies. So over many years, he collected different samples of plants and animals that he found. Now, eventually, the boat stopped at this set of islands called the Galapagos Islands, and this is kind of a stop that they would go to restock on food. They would catch sea turtles to eat. They would stock up on fresh water. But on these islands, Darwin noticed some differences that really started him questioning what was going on. Now, what he noticed was, even though there were animals on the island that were the similar types of animals that he would find on the mainland, there were differences to the way they looked and the way they acted. And the first thing he noticed was that even though the animals were a little different, they were perfectly adapted to survive in their environment on this island. So it got him thinking. Some of the animals that he looked at were the birds and the marine iguanas. So here I have a picture of what have become known as Darwin's finches. Even though they were all a same type of bird, a finch, and there were finches, which is a type of bird. There were finches on the mainland, but what he noticed on this island, there were different types of finches, and you can see from this picture, some were very dark, some were very light colored, and you'll notice that their beaks were very different. What he noticed that each one of them, between their color and their beak shape, was perfectly adapted to where they lived on the island, whether it was on the ground or in a tree, and their beaks were perfectly adapted to the food that they ate. Some of them fed off of the fruit of cactus, some of them actually ate seeds from some of the other plants, and some of them were insect eaters. But each of these birds, although the same type of bird, a finch, had varied differences that allowed them to fit perfectly in their habitat on the island. Another animal he looked at on the island was the marine iguana. The iguana that was on the mainland was predominantly a green-colored iguana, but on this island it was not so. There were two types he found on the island. On the coastline, where the rocks along the shore were a dark gray to a black color, the iguana's coloring, as you see in these top pictures here, the left pictures, those iguanas were a dark gray to a blackish color to fit in, to be able to camouflage on the rocks on the beach. The iguana on the right was more colorful and fit in better on the inner part of the island where there was lots of colorful plants. Another main difference he found in these iguanas was their face shape. If you look on the iguana on the left, you'll notice that his face was much shorter and a little bit flatter in the front by the mouth and the nose. these iguanas also had a flattened tail. And what he found after watching them for a while is these iguanas did not feed on the island. They actually went into the water and scraped algae off of the rocks that were in the water. So the flattened tail allowed them to swim, and the shorter face allowed them to be able to successfully scrape algae without damaging the face. The picture, the iguana on the right, they had the longer face because they actually fed off of cactus. So the longer face allowed them to get in between the spines to bite off pieces of cactus to feed on. Now, with these two animals, the finches in the last picture and the marine iguanas in this picture, he noticed that, again, they were perfectly adapted to their life on this island. But he knew that something had to have happened because none of the birds and none of the iguanas on the mainland looked like these. So it wasn't like one of them hitched a ride on a piece of driftwood or something and ended up on the island. They looked completely different. So it got him wondering, how was this happening? At each stop, the mainland and these islands, he took many notes and he collected a lot of specimens to take back with him to the mainland. And for the next 20 years, he tried to find an explanation for why these animals were different on these islands. Now, he worked with another biologist by the name of Alfred Wallace, and Darwin presented this concept of the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution was that things were changing. So, to explain how the changes were taking place, Darwin wrote a book. It's called On the Origin of Species. Now, if you're interested in the book, you can find it online. However, it is a very dry read. If you have trouble sleeping at night, it's probably a good book to help you fall asleep. In this book, he explains the concept of natural selection. And this is how he explains how these changes occur and how evolution happens. Natural selection means that those animals that are best adapted, or I shouldn't even say animals, those organisms, because it's any living thing, that are best adapted to fit into their surrounding will survive and reproduce. Nature is selecting them to live and reproduce. So to understand how this works, I'm going to talk briefly about a term called overproduction. Overproduction means producing or making more that's where the over comes in, more offspring than the environment can support. For an example, dandelions. I'm going to show you in the next picture, or the next picture here, the next slide will have a picture of a dandelion, and you will be able to see all the seeds that it has. I will also show you a picture of a mouse and all the children they have. Now, I'm going to explain overproduction more when I get to these pictures, but overproduction, by overproducing children, you're ensuring that some will live. So here on this dandelion, you can see all the little brown structures at the end of the white fuzzies. Each one of these little brown pieces is a seed. So one dandelion will produce hundreds of seeds, because when the wind comes along and blows these seeds off, not every seed is going to end up in the perfect spot to grow. Some are going to end up where it's too dry. Some are going to end up where it's too wet. Some are going to end up in the shade. Some are going to end up on gravel or concrete or asphalt and not be able to grow. So by overproducing, making lots and lots of seeds, the dandelion is ensuring that some of these seeds will at least land where it's good to grow. Overproduction also happens in some of our smaller animals. Now, first things first, the mother mouse is not eating the baby, it's cleaning it. So don't panic. But you will see how many babies this one mouse will produce. However, this mouse cannot produce enough milk to feed all these babies and allow them to live. And in nature, it wouldn't be a problem, because in nature, disease will kill off some of the babies. Cold weather will kill off some of the babies. Predators will kill off some of the babies. So the babies that live, by having lots and lots of babies, you're ensuring that some of them will survive to grow up and be their own mama mouses. Now, with overproduction, it is going to result in competition. So I'm going to use an example of a baby chipmunk. If I was a mama chipmunk, I'm going to have lots of babies. And then eventually I'm going to take them out. I'm going to teach them how to forage and find food on their own. However, they cannot live with me forever, because my tree or my burrow that I live in is only big enough for me and maybe one or two of the others. So they're going to have to go out on their own. And this is going to result in competition, because there is going to be limited food and limited shelter in an area. So the baby chipmunks are going to have to compete against each other to find food and to find shelter. So when we talk about this, about overproduction and nature selecting you to live, only the strongest or smartest are going to be able to survive to reproduce. The strongest and the smartest are going to be the ones to win the food, to win the shelter, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be able to survive. And if they survive, once they grow up, they can reproduce to continue on the offspring, or to continue on the species. The others that are not as strong and are not as smart are not going to be able to get the food and the shelter they need, and therefore nature is going to select them to die. I mentioned when we talked about genetics that nature is cruel. Nature's rules are very harsh, and this is the way nature ensures that the things that survive are strong enough to be surviving. So another name for natural selection is survival of the fittest. And this is a phrase that you have probably heard before. Nature is going to select the animals that are the fittest, the ones that are the strongest, fastest, most common sense, the smartest. And they're the ones that are going to be able to survive, because they're the ones best adapted to their surroundings. Now, we talked about major mutations being good, and I mentioned on the last note taker that we're going to call good mutations adaptations. So we can have big mutations happen. However, we can also have very small mutations happen within a species. When these tiny little differences appear, we call these variations. So to vary means to be different. So the example I'm going to give you in the notes, and you're going to see on the evolution quiz, the example, this same example, is polar bears. If we were to gather all the polar bears up in the Arctic and look at them, you would notice that there are going to be some differences in the thickness of their coats. Some are going to have thicker coats of fur than others. Those that have thicker coats are going to be fitter or more adapted to survive their conditions because it's so cold there. So the ones with thicker coats have a better chance of surviving and reproducing, where those that have the thinner coat have an increased chance of dying, and then they're not going to be able to reproduce and pass that variation on. So we can have variations among members of the same species, And they're another reason that natural selection can actually occur. So natural selection can occur for tiny little differences. Natural selection can occur for a big major difference. Now, one example of a major adaptation is what happened in White Sands National Monument. And I'm going to show you a picture on the next slide that you'll be able to visualize more how this happened. Now, the sand dunes in this national park are white, and white mice are able to survive here because of a helpful mutation. The earlier group of mice that moved into this area were actually brownish in color. But the mutation, the major mutation that happened, which ended up being a good adaptation, was that a couple of mice were born with a lighter or white coat. And this lighter colored fur, this lighter colored hair on them, allowed them to blend in better with the white sand dunes when they were out foraging for food. So being able to blend in better meant that birds flying up above that were looking for you for dinner were not going to be able to see you as easily as they could see the brown mice. So eventually, the darker mice, the population of darker mice pretty much disappeared, and the lighter colored mouse, natural selection, nature selected the lighter colored mice over the darker mice to survive. So we see here in this picture, the top left corner is a picture of White Sands National Monument. You can see the sands are very light colored, almost white. And I've put a picture at the bottom of a white mouse and a brown mouse. And if you can imagine these two mice running along the sands, foraging for their food, the bird in the air that is looking for dinner is going to easily be able to pick out the brown mouse, and you can see the look of fear on the poor little brown mouse's face. The bird would be picking off the brown mice and eating them for dinner. Sometimes adaptations, or the good mutations in living things, actually become a mirror of what's happening in their surroundings. Now, the British peppered moth is an example I'm going to talk about here. And what was considered a good mutation was dependent on where the British peppered moth actually lived. Now, in the 1850s, most of the British peppered moths were actually a grayish color. They looked like they were kind of a white with the black speckles on them to kind of give them an overall kind of grayish shade to them. And only a few of the moths were a solid black color. What would happen was the gray moths, when they landed on the trunk of a tree, they blended in very well. Whereas when a black moth landed on a tree, it could be seen very easily against the tree bark, and the birds would pick them off and eat them. So before the 1850s, we had high population of the gray, low population of the black moths. But then we had the Industrial Revolution happen. And in areas where factories were built, the factories gave off all this pollution, and as it settled out of the sky, it covered the trunks of the trees, and the trunks of the trees became black in color. Well, then the coloration of the black moth became the good adaptation. Because now, when the black moth landed on the tree in areas where there were factories, it blended in. However, the gray moth stood out, and they became eaten by the birds. So this is an example of adaptations that you mirror in your environment. So areas where there were no factories, the gray moth blended in better, but in areas where there were factories and pollution, the black moth blended in better. So depending on where they lived was depending on which one was better for the environment. Here's a picture of the gray and the black peppered moth. The top left picture shows both of them sitting on a tree, on the green of a tree, and you can see the gray one is very light colored and the black one, other than a little bit of white on his face, is predominantly all black. The top right-hand picture shows a gray moth on a regular tree bark that has not been in an area where there's a factory, so there's no pollution covering it, and that moth blends in very well. But the bottom picture shows you a tree trunk in an area where there is a factory, where pollution has occurred and has covered that tree trunk, and you'll notice that the black moth now blends much better than the gray moth. In the last section of this note taker, we're going to talk about extinctions and how evolution has happened both quickly and on a slow scale. So, an extinction is when a type of animal or a type of life, whether it's a plant, bacteria, fungus, protus, or an animal, when it completely disappears. No more living on this earth. That's extinction. And about 65 million years ago, we had probably one of the biggest extinctions in the world. There was an asteroid that hit the Earth, and by kicking up the dirt and debris into the air, it covered up the sun, and we had a mass extinction. 95% of all living things on Earth, whether it was a bacteria, protus, fungus, plant, or animal, 95% of all living things died off. And the dinosaurs were in that group. This is called a mass extinction because so many things die at one time. And a mass extinction plays an important role in how new species can actually develop. Because when a mass extinction happens, it leaves a whole lot of empty space. And this allows things to then spread out into new environments. And when things spread out into new environments, then they need to change. This changing is called adaptive radiation. So, if we have one group of animals that spreads out, and we have some that, maybe they eventually, or beginning, maybe they lived in a field. And then we had a mass extinction that opened up all this environment around them, which gave them new food sources, new shelter. So what's going to happen is that original group that lived in a field, a few of them are going to break off of that group, and they're going to move to new areas. So you might get a group that moves to the ocean, to the coastline. You might get a group that moves to the mountains, and you might get a group that moves to a forest nearby. Well, the main group that lived in the field may have had certain characteristics that made living in the field perfect for them. So the groups that now move to the seashore, to the mountains, and to the forest are now going to have to evolve new adaptations to allow them to fit in their new environments. So adaptive radiation is when one group radiates out or moves out to new areas, and then they adapt to their new surroundings. Now, once they adapt, and it's not going to be overnight, it's not going to be a week or two, it's going to take them probably hundreds to thousands of years to be able to adapt to their new area. But the groups in the new areas, if they try to go back to the original area, are going to find that they are now going to be so different, they're going to be a new species. This is how we explain Darwin's finches. There probably was a mainland finch, a finch that came from the mainland to these islands. And then when it saw that there was all this room and these different habitats on this island, whether it was the coastline, whether it was the ground, in a cactus, in a tree, they found that there were all these different habitats, and these groups spread out over the island. And then over thousands of years, evolution then took over. And they started to change, and they would get these new mutations. And if the mutation made them better adapted to live in this area, then they are the ones that survived and the old ones died. So they changed enough over time that we now had all these different types of birds. So adaptive radiation is how we explain how the finches changed, how the iguanas changed on the islands. After the dinosaurs' mass extinction, there was a creature that actually lived in the shadow of dinosaurs for millions of years, and it underwent a huge adaptive radiation. And this little guy down here at the bottom represents part of that group, and that would be us, the mammals. Once dinosaurs did die out, the small mammals were able to come out, the ones that did survive, and now there was all this open space on Earth that the dinosaurs were no longer inhabiting. So mammals were able to spread out to new environments, and over thousands to millions of years, they were able to adapt to these new surroundings and become all the different species that we have today. Now, scientists have always argued, does evolution happen slowly? Does it happen quickly? And as far back as Darwin explained that species evolve gradually. This means very slowly. It could take tens of thousands of years to 1,000,000 years for a species to evolve or change enough that we have a new species. However, mass extinctions have shown that we get quick change, very rapid, fast change. And this is called punctuated equilibrium. So we get equilibrium where everything's going along, everything's the same, doesn't change. That's equilibrium. But then all of a sudden, that ends. We have mass extinction. It's punctuated. If you think punctuation at the end of a sentence, equilibrium has been punctuated or ended. So that means since we have all this stuff now, this open room, and these animals and plants and things can move to this new space, we have to have fast evolution to be able to fill these new spots. So today, scientists do believe that evolution can occur both ways. Evolution is always happening gradually around us, but there are times, and over our history, we know that there have been about 4 or 5 major extinctions that have caused fast evolution to be able to happen. So this last picture, or the last slide that I'm going to show you, is how punctuated equilibrium and how gradual evolution both happen in butterflies. The picture on the left shows slow evolution happening, where we start off at the bottom with one species of butterfly, and over time we get tiny little mutations and tiny little mutations that change, and you can see it has to do with the coloring and the marking on it. But you notice that by the time we get to the end, we have 2 new species that are very different from the original, but it takes a long time to get there. On the right-hand side of the picture, we have punctuated equilibrium, which happens when you have that mass extinction, you have new environments open up, boom, there's a major adaptation or a major mutation, boom, there's a major mutation, which gives you the kind of orangish or the white and black butterfly, and then they continually to gradually, but that gives you 3 new species because you have 2 major mutations happen very quickly. Please don't forget to answer the 3-question assessment that follows the video.